The night settles slowly over the Panamanian jungle, the kind of night that seems to breathe on its own, warm, humid, and almost alive. Crickets whisper in the underbrush, tree frogs croak in soft rhythm, and a thick canopy overhead sways gently as if trying to keep ancient secrets from slipping out into the world. In this quiet darkness, the outline of Panama becomes something mystical, a place shaped by shadows long before politics or armies ever touched it. It is here, in this atmosphere of silence and deep green mystery, that the story of Manuel Noriega truly begins, not in the glare of international headlines, but in the hidden corners of a land where power often moved invisibly. The jungle around Panama has always understood secrecy, and in many ways, so did Noriega. He grew into a man who could disappear in plain sight, blending into political circles, intelligence networks, and criminal alliances with the same ease that the jungle absorbs a footprint. To understand him is to walk slowly through this dense landscape, listening for the faintest rustle, the smallest clue, the soft echo of ambition moving beneath the surface. For decades, Noriega operated like a ghost with a uniform, a man who never raised his voice unless necessary, who rarely looked rattled, who offered a calm, stoic smile even when storms raged around him. It was this ability to remain quietly in control that made him so valuable, and so dangerous, to almost everyone he worked with. Long before the world called him a dictator, before news anchors labeled him a drug trafficker, before Washington turned him into a villain for primetime television, Noriega was something else entirely, an unseen bridge connecting worlds that should never have touched. He was a young intelligence officer who became the eyes and ears of the CIA in Central America. He was the loyal subordinate of General Omar Torrijos, a man he admired and possibly envied. He was a discreet facilitator for the Medellín Cartel, a banker for drug lords, and a manipulator of power whose hands were always clean in public, even when they were stained in private. Every role he played overlapped, forming a web of alliances so complex that even those closest to him rarely knew whom he truly served. What made Noriega so unusual was not just that he worked with multiple cartels, multiple governments, and multiple intelligence agencies, it was that he did so without ever fully belonging to any of them. He was always useful, never fully loyal. Always present, never fully committed. He mastered the art of giving just enough information to gain trust but never enough to become expendable. His rise to influence was not loud or dramatic, but slow, methodical, built on whispers exchanged in dimly lit rooms and negotiations conducted behind layers of secrecy. In a world where power is often measured by visibility, Noriega's strength came from remaining unseen. On nights like this, with moonlight filtering through leaves and branches, it becomes easier to imagine the world he navigated. Small boats gliding quietly along the canal, carrying cargo that few dared inspect. Military officers meeting in shadowed barracks, trading intelligence and rumors. Cartel emissaries arriving in unmarked cars, stepping into conversations where fortunes were made with a single nod. Diplomats sending confidential cables back to Washington, describing a man they couldn't quite predict, a man who seemed to know things he shouldn't know. All of it forming a mosaic of hidden movements and silent decisions shaping the fate of an entire nation. What made Noriega's story even more remarkable was his ability to remain calm while walking this dangerous tightrope. In public, he presented himself as disciplined, controlled, even friendly. His voice was soft, his expressions measured, his posture steady. He rarely appeared hurried, even when circumstances demanded urgency. There was something unsettling about this calmness, something that suggested he understood more than he revealed. It was as if he saw the world as a chessboard, not a battlefield, where every move had meaning, every alliance was temporary, and every betrayal was simply a shift in strategy. Those who underestimated him soon learned that still waters often ran the deepest. Yet beneath his composed exterior, there were layers of contradictions. He was fiercely nationalistic, but relied heavily on foreign support. He hated communism, yet worked with leftist movements when it suited him. He claimed to fight against corruption, yet became one of the richest men in Panama through bribes and illicit deals. These contradictions did not weaken him, they made him more unpredictable, more valuable to those seeking influence in Central America, and more dangerous to those who opposed him. In a region where loyalties shifted with the tides, Noriega thrived on instability. As the night deepens, the jungle seems to grow denser, its secrets thicker. The sounds become softer, more deliberate, as if the world is settling into a deep breath. It is in this quiet moment that Noriega's presence becomes most vivid, a man shaped by silence, raised by struggle, who learned early that knowledge was more powerful than bullets, and fear more effective than friendship. His future would hold invasions, international trials, betrayals on a global scale, and the collapse of everything he built. But that reckoning lies far ahead. For now, he is the man who moves through the shadows unseen, building alliances with cartels, generals, and intelligence agencies alike. Listeners may wonder how a single man managed to navigate so many conflicting worlds without being crushed. That mystery is what draws people to his story, the idea that someone could stand at the center of so many storms and still maintain control. But control, like everything else in Noriega's life, was fragile. Beneath the surface, pressure was building. Enemies were watching. Allies were growing suspicious. Files were being collected. On a quiet night like this, the jungle may seem calm, but danger lurked everywhere. And Noriega, for all his confidence, could not outrun the consequences forever. For now, though, we remain in this moment, at the edge of where his legend begins. A man formed by shadows, rising quietly in a land that understood him well. And as the jungle exhales softly into the night, the story begins to unfold, step by careful step, toward the world he would one day rule, and eventually lose. The earliest years of Manuel Noriega's life unfolded in the narrow, crowded slums of Panama City, places where the sun beat heavily on tin rooftops, and the nights carried a mix of street noise, laughter, and quiet desperation. It was a world of uneven sidewalks, stray dogs wandering aimlessly, and children running barefoot through alleys that smelled of dust and humid air. Noriega began life not as a child destined for power, but as a boy almost forgotten by those who should have cared for him most. His mother gave him away shortly after birth, and the family who took him in struggled simply to feed themselves. In a neighborhood where every day felt like a slow battle, he learned early that no one was coming to save him. That small truth, absorbed in childhood, grew into the rigid armor he carried throughout his life. Yet even in poverty, there were moments of stillness, quiet evenings when the city's chaos seemed to pause. Noriega would sit outside his home, watching streetlights flicker and listening to distant radios playing soft boleros. These rare peaceful moments painted contrasts in his young mind, the softness of night against the harsh daylight reality. They created a habit in him, an instinct to observe, quietly, carefully, with a focus far beyond his age. While other children played, he noticed things: who controlled the neighborhood, who people feared, who people obeyed, and how authority shaped every interaction. It was an unintentional education, but one that would shape the way he viewed the world. His childhood was not marked by affection or stability. He never truly had a place to belong, never knew the warmth of a stable family. And because he had nothing to lose, he developed a sense of resilience that bordered on emotional detachment. When classmates mocked him for his worn-out clothes or the rumors about his parents, he didn't fight back. He simply absorbed the information and filed it away, learning how people behaved when they sensed weakness. Years later, he would master the opposite, projecting strength so convincingly that no one dared test him. But these early wounds created a cold determination, a belief that survival required vigilance and toughness. Walking through the streets of his neighborhood as a boy, Noriega saw life in its rawest form. He saw vendors pushing carts under the heavy tropical heat, mothers carrying water buckets home, men arguing loudly over debts, and long afternoons filled with the distant rumble of buses. The slums were alive with activity, but underneath the noise was a quiet struggle that threaded through every home. Hunger was familiar. Short tempers were common. People learned to work with what little they had. Noriega, watching all of this, learned how fragile life could be and how crucial control was in a world that seemed constantly uncertain. School offered him a different perspective, though even that came with challenges. He was mocked for his small frame, for the rumors surrounding his birth, and for being a quiet child who rarely smiled. But he also displayed something unusual, a sharp mind and an ability to understand complex ideas quickly. Teachers who paid attention noticed the intensity in his eyes, the way he observed everything before speaking. He never disrupted class, never drew attention to himself, but his presence left an impression. There was something calculating about him even then, a seriousness uncommon in children his age. Over time, this quiet intelligence became his shield, helping him stand out in a slum where most boys drifted into petty crime. Noriega didn't want to be another boy lost to the streets. Even at a young age, he sensed that he was meant for something else, something that required discipline and strategy. The neighborhood taught him how quickly power could shift, and how those who understood people's fears often controlled their fate. He watched local troublemakers gain influence simply by acting confidently. He observed how older kids controlled access to alley shortcuts, water pumps, and game spaces. Small territories mattered in the slums, and those who learned to read human behavior survived the longest. At home, life was no easier. His adoptive family was stern, emotionally distant, and often overwhelmed by financial strain. They provided shelter but not warmth. Affection was a luxury they could not afford, and Noriega grew used to the silence, long evenings without conversation, meals eaten quickly, and the constant pressure of knowing there was never enough money. These early experiences hardened him, shaping his belief that emotional vulnerability was dangerous. He carried that belief throughout his adulthood, rarely allowing anyone to see what he truly felt. Despite everything, Noriega nurtured a quiet dream of escaping the slum. He did not imagine wealth or luxury, he imagined structure, purpose, and a life where he wouldn't be at the mercy of circumstance. That dream grew stronger every time he witnessed the chaos around him. Fires breaking out in crowded shacks. Fights erupting over small disputes. Police entering the neighborhood with stern faces and heavy boots. The unpredictability pushed him to seek something more controlled, more disciplined. Some nights, lying awake in the heat of the slum, he listened to the sounds around him, distant engines, muffled arguments, the occasional stray cat knocking over a tin can. These sounds shaped his understanding of the world. They taught him that life was full of forces that could crush a person if they weren't careful. And so he became careful. He became patient. He learned to wait, to watch, and to prepare. These early years also built a strange duality in him. Hardship taught him to be ruthless, but loneliness carved out a deep well of introspection. He thought more than he spoke. He dreamed more than he admitted. And slowly, a quiet ambition began forming, a desire to rise high enough that no one could ever push him aside again. The turning point came when he learned about the military schools that accepted poor but intelligent boys. The idea of a uniform, of belonging to something structured and respected, filled him with a kind of longing he had never felt before. A life with rules, discipline, and authority seemed like a ticket out of the chaos. Military school became his escape route, the door out of the slum and into a future he could shape with his own hands. It was the first time he allowed himself to believe he could be more than a child of poverty, more than the product of neglect. As he prepared to leave the only world he had ever known, the streets of Panama City seemed quieter than usual, as if holding their breath. The boy who had learned to survive through silence was stepping into a new life, one that would shape him into a man the world would one day fear. But in this moment, he was still just a child walking away from the narrow alleys, carrying with him the shadows of his past and the determination to never return the same way. The transition from the slums of Panama City to the strict grounds of military school felt like stepping into another universe. For young Manuel Noriega, the sudden order and discipline were as startling as a bright light in a dark room. Gone were the loud markets, the chaotic alleys, the constant uncertainty of living day to day. In their place stood tall gates, neatly cut lawns, and instructors whose commands carried the finality of thunder. The school was not luxurious, but compared to the slums, it felt like an institution of power. For the first time in his life, Noriega sensed the presence of rules that could shape a person rather than crush them. Each morning began before sunrise, with the echo of boots striking pavement in practiced rhythm. Cadets lined up with straight backs and fixed gazes, their uniforms stiff and clean. Noriega, smaller than most boys his age, learned quickly that hesitation was punished and discipline was rewarded. He watched how even the toughest students bowed their heads when an instructor walked past, how a simple command could freeze an entire group into silence. To him, it was fascinating. Where others felt fear, he felt understanding. This was a place where authority did not need to shout to be obeyed, it simply existed, strong and unquestionable. He became an observer again, just as he had been in the slums, but his environment was different now. Instead of watching street hustlers and vendors, he studied drill sergeants, officers, and instructors. He noticed how leadership worked here, how some officers commanded respect through confidence, how others relied on strictness, and how a few created obedience simply by their presence. The hierarchy was clear, structured, predictable. And for Noriega, predictability meant safety. In this world, he didn't have to wonder where he stood. Rank defined everything. His first crimes, small and quiet, were not the reckless acts of a delinquent, but the careful tests of someone learning how power worked. While other cadets sneaked snacks or cigarettes, Noriega learned how to bend rules without breaking them entirely. He helped students hide contraband in exchange for favors. He memorized schedules to know when instructors would be nearby. He quietly observed who was willing to talk, who could be bribed, and who feared punishment the most. These early actions were not about rebellion, they were about preparation. He was learning the system from the inside, testing its weak points. It was here, surrounded by regimentation and silent ambition, that Noriega's natural talent for intelligence work first revealed itself. He had an uncanny ability to gather information without being noticed. He could listen without being seen, remember details others dismissed, and read faces as if they were open books. In a world where everything depended on control, this talent made him quietly powerful. He was the cadet who always knew things, who had heard about upcoming inspections, who knew which officer disliked which behavior, who was secretly fighting with whom. His knowledge was not used openly, but subtly, strategically. Instructors recognized his potential. They saw his seriousness, his calmness, and his sharp perception. While other boys struggled to keep up with lessons, Noriega absorbed concepts quickly: geography, political history, national security. He wasn't just learning how to be a soldier, he was learning how nations operated, how conflicts began, and how information shaped outcomes. His teachers often described him as intense, focused, and unusually mature. Some were impressed. Others were wary. Outside the classroom, Noriega discovered something else: the intoxicating feeling of belonging. For a child who had grown up invisible, there was something deeply comforting about wearing the same uniform as the others, matching their steps, sharing their routines. The military didn't care about his childhood or the rumors around his birth. It cared only about discipline and competence. Here, at last, he had a place to stand, solid, defined, and respected. Yet beneath the surface of discipline, something darker was taking shape. The quiet boy who had once absorbed the cruelty of the slums without complaint was learning how to wield authority himself. He realized how fear could shape behavior, how a simple threat could achieve what persuasion could not. When smaller cadets were bullied, Noriega didn't step in with kindness. Instead, he intervened with cold efficiency, making it clear that anyone crossing him or those under his unofficial watch would regret it. He never shouted. He never fought in the open. But he carried a calm, dangerous certainty that unsettled those around him. Even at a young age, he understood that violence, when controlled, was more effective than chaos. Whispers about him began circulating among students. They said he always knew too much. They said he seemed to have no fear. They said he watched everything. Some boys avoided him. Others admired him. A few tried to befriend him, but Noriega never let anyone too close. Trust, to him, was a weakness he could not afford. During field exercises and combat drills, he proved surprisingly capable. He wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but he was strategic, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always analyzing distances, wind direction, and timing. He excelled not because of brute force, but because of careful calculation. This attracted the attention of superior officers who quietly took note of him. They saw in him a mind suited for intelligence work, not just military command. His life took on a new rhythm. Days were filled with drills and lessons, nights were filled with studying, observing, and planning. The slums became a memory, fading but not forgotten. He carried the lessons of his childhood with him: never show weakness, never rely on sympathy, never trust blindly. But those lessons blended with new ones: structure, discipline, hierarchy. Together, they formed a personality both sharp and guarded. As he progressed through the ranks of the academy, Noriega began to dream bigger. He no longer saw the military as merely an escape from poverty, he saw it as a ladder, a path leading to influence, authority, and power. He saw how officers controlled soldiers, how generals controlled policies, and how intelligence officers controlled information. And he understood instinctively which of those 3 held the most real power. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his ambition began to sharpen. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't boast or make grand claims. His was a quiet ambition, the kind that grew steadily in the shadows. He knew he would not remain small forever. He knew his background didn't define his future. What mattered was strategy, discipline, and timing. And he possessed all 3. By the time he completed his early training, Noriega was no longer the boy the world ignored. He had become someone who understood power more deeply than most adults. He had learned how to move through structured systems, how to observe people's weaknesses, and how to make himself invaluable. He had tasted authority, and he wanted more, not out of greed, but out of a need to never be powerless again. Ahead of him lay opportunities he could not yet imagine: intelligence work, political alliances, hidden negotiations, and a relationship with the United States that would shape his destiny. But all of that would come later. For now, he was standing firmly at the edge of the path that would lead him into the darkest and most influential corridors of Panama's future. Long before the world heard his name spoken on the news, long before international courts and invasions and headlines, Manuel Noriega lived another life, one tucked deep inside the hidden machinery of global intelligence. It began quietly, almost subtly, during the years when the United States watched Latin America with unblinking eyes. The Cold War was spreading its long, cold fingers across every continent, and Panama, with its canal and its strategic position, was far too valuable to ignore. In this tense atmosphere, Noriega's path crossed with an organization that would shape the next 3 decades of his life: the Central Intelligence Agency. The connection did not begin dramatically. There were no cinematic meetings or whispered promises in smoke-filled rooms. Instead, it began with recognition: an American officer noticing a young Panamanian intelligence trainee who displayed unusual discipline and a gift for gathering information. Noriega had already built a reputation for being quiet, controlled, and impossible to read. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered everything. And most importantly, he understood people, not just their words, but their fears, their desires, and their hidden motives. In the intelligence world, those instincts were priceless. The Americans tested him at first. Small assignments. Basic requests. Observations to report, messages to deliver, rumors to verify. To their surprise, Noriega delivered not just what they asked for, but more: details, patterns, insights that revealed a mind built for covert work. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He presented information with the clarity of someone who understood the weight it carried. It was during these early exchanges that the CIA realized they had found someone uniquely suited to their interests. For Noriega, these tasks were not merely duties. They were opportunities. Each message he delivered, each report he provided, gave him a glimpse into a world larger than the one he knew, a world of hidden alliances, strategic secrets, and global power struggles. He saw how intelligence documents moved through hands that influenced entire nations. He saw how information, not just armies, shaped history. And somewhere deep inside him, a realization took root: knowledge was the highest form of power. When the CIA formally brought him in, the relationship grew quietly, under the radar of most Panamanian officials. They trained him, step by step, teaching him how to run informants, how to handle covert communication, how to analyze political movements, and how to predict unrest before it erupted. He learned about coded messages, dead drops, surveillance techniques, and the subtle art of influencing events without ever appearing involved. It was a world of shadows and whispers, and Noriega adapted to it as if he had always belonged there. His instructors noticed something rare: Noriega did not question the ethics of his assignments. He did not ask why certain individuals were being monitored or what larger strategies his reports were supporting. He focused solely on efficiency. This calm obedience made him an ideal asset. He wasn't driven by ideology. He wasn't swayed by political passion. His motivation was simple and steady: he wanted to rise, to be indispensable, to hold power through knowledge. And the CIA was more than willing to give him the tools. The Cold War atmosphere made their partnership even more valuable. Across Latin America, communist movements were gaining momentum. Guerrilla groups were forming in jungles and mountains. Ideologies were spreading faster than governments could contain them. The United States feared that one wrong step could tilt the entire region toward the Soviet sphere. In this climate, Noriega became their inside man, a source of information, a stabilizing force, or, when necessary, a subtle disruptor. He was instructed to track student protests, political dissent, labor strikes, any sign of leftist influence. He compiled lists, monitored meetings, and quietly removed threats before they grew. Washington appreciated his efficiency. They sent funding, equipment, and praise through discreet channels. In return, Noriega fed them exactly what they wanted: intelligence delivered with precision and discretion. But even in these early years, the relationship was complicated. Noriega's loyalty was never absolute. While he worked for the Americans, he also expanded his own network of contacts inside Panama: military officers, businessmen, local power brokers, and rising political figures. He learned how to balance these relationships, how to avoid letting one side see too much of what he was doing for the other. This ability to juggle loyalties would later define his career, allowing him to operate in multiple worlds simultaneously. Late at night, when most cadets slept, Noriega would sit alone at his desk, reviewing notes and analyzing patterns. He studied political theories, military strategies, and psychological methods of control. The more he learned, the more confident he became. He was moving silently through a world that few Panamanians ever touched. He knew things about his country, its secrets, its vulnerabilities, its future, that only a handful of people could see. And with every passing month, he became more valuable to Washington. Yet even as the relationship deepened, Noriega never allowed the Americans to fully own him. He maintained a certain distance, a calm caution. He gave them what they needed without ever revealing all that he knew. He understood something fundamental: an asset who gives everything becomes replaceable. But an asset who reveals only half of the truth, who holds back just enough, becomes indispensable. Noriega intended to be indispensable. The Americans admired his efficiency but underestimated his ambition. They did not see the growing coldness behind his quiet smile, the calculating mind silently preparing for a future beyond their control. They believed he was shaping into a reliable ally. In reality, he was learning how to use their training to build his own power, one that might eventually stand apart from the very agency that helped create him. Still, during these early years, there was harmony. The CIA had found a capable operative. Noriega had found the doorway into influence. Both sides believed they were in control. Neither realized how deeply intertwined their futures would become, or how violently that alliance would one day shatter. For now, the nights remained calm, filled with the soft tapping of typewriters, the rustle of classified documents, and the quiet confidence of a young intelligence officer discovering the shadows he would soon command. The relationship between Noriega and the CIA was only beginning, but already, its foundations were shaping the destiny of Panama and the path of a man who had learned, from childhood, that the deepest power often moved unseen. When Manuel Noriega first crossed paths with General Omar Torrijos, it felt as if two very different storms had brushed against each other, one loud and charismatic, the other silent and calculating. Torrijos was already a towering figure in Panama, a leader beloved by the poor and respected across Latin America for his vision, his charm, and his ability to inspire loyalty without demanding it. He spoke with warmth, walked among the people with ease, and carried himself with a confidence that made even foreign diplomats take notice. Noriega, by contrast, was still a man rising quietly through the ranks, shaped more by shadows than sunlight. Yet Torrijos saw something in him almost immediately, perhaps the same sharp intelligence that had impressed the CIA, or the unwavering discipline that could withstand political turmoil. Their first meetings were formal, held in offices that smelled of ink, sweat, and humid air drifting in from open windows. Torrijos would ask questions in his smooth, conversational tone, leaning back in his chair with the natural authority of someone born to lead. Noriega, standing stiffly at attention, would answer with precision, never adding unnecessary details, never revealing emotion. And yet, beneath the surface of these interactions, an understanding began to develop. Torrijos needed someone who could gather information, predict threats, and handle the delicate world of political intelligence. Noriega wanted a powerful patron, someone whose influence could lift him above the crowded landscape of ambitious officers. Their interests aligned perfectly. As time passed, the bond between them strengthened, becoming something between loyalty and strategic partnership. Torrijos entrusted Noriega with sensitive assignments, monitoring potential coups, intercepting rumors of dissent, tracking foreign agents, and quietly managing the military's internal tensions. Noriega delivered results with cold efficiency, earning Torrijos's trust one careful report at a time. It wasn't friendship, not in the warm sense, but it was something solid, two men rising in the same direction, aware that their strengths complemented each other. Torrijos was the face of the nation, the one who shook hands, gave speeches, and inspired crowds. Noriega was the one who watched from the corners, identifying threats before they materialized. Together they formed a balance, charisma and calculation, warmth and vigilance. Torrijos extended his hand to the world, while Noriega monitored the shadows behind him. It was this balance that allowed Panama to grow more stable under Torrijos's rule, even as political storms gathered across Latin America. Despite their partnership, subtle tensions existed. Torrijos trusted Noriega, but he also sensed the darkness inside him, the sharp edges carved from a childhood of abandonment, the ambition that never slept, the cold stare that revealed nothing. Torrijos was a man of the people, someone who believed in negotiation and diplomacy, even when dealing with opponents. Noriega, shaped by harsher experiences, understood power differently. To him, control was not earned through charm but through leverage, secrets, and knowledge. Occasionally, Torrijos would glance at Noriega during briefings and wonder what thoughts were hidden behind that calm expression. Yet he still believed he could shape him, guide him, perhaps even soften him. For Noriega, Torrijos became more than a commander, he became a model of leadership, powerful, respected, and unafraid to challenge stronger nations. The famous Panama Canal treaties, which returned control of the canal from the United States to Panama, filled Noriega with admiration. To him, Torrijos was the kind of leader who could pull a small nation out from under the shadow of a superpower. Watching Torrijos negotiate with American presidents showed Noriega a new form of strength, one built not on intimidation but on confidence and principle. It made him realize that power did not always need to be loud to be effective. Sometimes, it only needed to be firm and unwavering. But even as Noriega admired him, he also studied him. Torrijos's charisma, his ability to read crowds, his balance between charm and authority, all of it fascinated Noriega. He took mental notes, observing how the general used stories to sway public opinion, how he kept military officers loyal by speaking to them with a mix of respect and fatherly firmness. While Torrijos shaped the vision of Panama, Noriega learned how to shape the forces that protected it. Their partnership took them through long nights of strategy meetings, where maps covered tables and cigarette smoke curled slowly toward the ceiling. Torrijos would speak passionately about Panama's future, about improving schools, protecting the canal, and giving the poor a voice. Noriega listened, taking in every word, though his mind also drifted toward the unseen battles that surrounded these dreams, foreign interests hungry for influence, local political rivals, and the constant threat of internal betrayal. Torrijos dreamed in broad strokes, Noriega prepared for the shadows that lingered beneath those dreams. Despite their differing worldviews, a mutual respect developed. Torrijos relied heavily on Noriega's intelligence reports, often calling him late at night to ask for updates or clarifications. Noriega, in turn, admired Torrijos's courage and his refusal to bow to pressure even from powerful nations. But they both knew their connection was not simple. Beneath the surface of trust lay a delicate tension. Noriega's rising influence could either become Torrijos's greatest strength or his most dangerous vulnerability. Outside their working relationship, Panama was transforming. Streets buzzed with nationalist pride, celebrations of independence echoed through the neighborhoods, and people began to believe that Torrijos was leading the nation toward a more dignified future. Noriega watched all of this quietly, understanding how powerful hope could be. He saw how the general's popularity made him nearly untouchable. And he also understood that if anything happened to Torrijos, a power vacuum would form, a vacuum he was increasingly positioned to fill. Still, at this stage, Noriega showed no signs of betrayal. He carried out his duties with precision, protecting Torrijos's interests as fiercely as his own. But history has a way of shifting suddenly, often without warning. And in the background of their partnership, forces were already aligning, some political, some foreign, some born from the dangerous mix of ambition and fate. There were whispers, quiet and uncertain, about enemies who didn't like how Torrijos challenged foreign powers. There were rumors of external interference, intelligence operations, and hidden agendas. Torrijos heard them but dismissed them with a confident smile. Noriega heard them and filed them away like pieces of a puzzle he hoped he would never need to solve. For the moment, the balance held, Torrijos leading with charisma, Noriega guiding from the shadows. Their alliance gave Panama strength, and together they stood against the uncertainties of a volatile region. But the path ahead was already shifting, carrying with it a quiet warning: the higher they climbed, the deeper the shadows that stretched before them. When Omar Torrijos died in that mysterious plane crash in 1981, the shock rippled through Panama like a silent wave. People mourned in the streets, crowds gathered around radios, and whispers spread from one neighborhood to another. But in the quiet rooms where power truly shifted, Manuel Noriega did not mourn the way the public did. He absorbed the news slowly, carefully, with the calmness of a man who had always prepared for the moment fate might grant him an opening. Torrijos had been his mentor, his protector, and in some ways his shield, but he had also been the one figure standing between Noriega and complete control. Now that shield was gone. In the days following the crash, Panama entered a strange haze. The country felt as if it were holding its breath. Leaders shuffled nervously through hallways, senior officers whispered behind doors, and foreign diplomats watched closely, waiting to see who would rise from the confusion. Noriega stood among them not as a grieving subordinate, but as a patient strategist. He understood that power does not always come to the loudest voice, but often to the one that moves with steady, silent purpose. And so, while others debated, he simply began taking control. The military leadership had been fractured for years, filled with officers who respected Torrijos but did not necessarily trust one another. Noriega used this fragmentation to his advantage. He visited barracks, spoke softly with commanders, and assured them that stability mattered more than ambition. He positioned himself as the natural successor to maintain order, presenting calmness at a time when others felt overwhelmed. Without declaring anything, without raising his voice, he slowly became the center of gravity within the Panamanian Defense Forces. Noriega never claimed Torrijos's charisma. He did not try to inspire crowds or win the affection of the masses. Instead, he focused on the machinery behind the stage: intelligence reports, personnel assignments, supply chains, foreign communication. While the public struggled to process their grief, Noriega was already reorganizing the invisible gears that controlled the nation. He replaced officers quietly, promoted those loyal to him, and sidelined those who questioned his intentions. Every decision was measured, every step calculated. By the time Panama's politicians realized what was happening, Noriega had already secured control where it mattered most. What made his rise even more striking was its subtlety. Noriega did not declare himself president, dictator, or supreme leader. He did not make grand speeches or claim titles. Instead, he occupied the role of intelligence chief, a position that, on paper, appeared secondary but in reality placed him at the very heart of power. He controlled the flow of information. He controlled surveillance. He controlled the military's secrets. And in a government built on fragile alliances, the man who controlled information controlled the future. Behind closed doors, Noriega cultivated relationships that would strengthen his grip. He met with business elites who feared instability. He met with foreign diplomats who preferred a predictable partner. He met with military officers who sought promotions or protection. Each conversation added another thread to the web he was spinning across Panama. People began to understand that opposing him was dangerous not because of open threats, but because of the quiet consequences that followed anyone who challenged his expanding influence. At the same time, Noriega maintained his previously established connections with the CIA. They had trained him, paid him, and relied on him for years. Washington saw him as a stabilizing force, someone who could maintain order during Panama's uncertain period. In their eyes, Noriega was a familiar figure in a region where unpredictability could spark geopolitical tremors. They did not yet see the ambition forming beneath his calm expression. They saw only an asset stepping into a vacuum left by Torrijos. This gave Noriega something priceless: time. With time, he expanded his intelligence network. Files were created on prominent politicians. Phone calls were monitored. Political opponents found themselves under watch without knowing why. Noriega was building a state where every whisper traveled back to him, where secrets had no safe place to hide. It was not the loud oppression of tyrants who ruled with iron fists, it was the quiet suffocation of a nation wrapped in unseen surveillance. The streets of Panama City continued their usual rhythm, vendors calling out prices, buses rumbling down crowded avenues, children playing soccer in warm, dusty fields. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. Rumors traveled more carefully. People lowered their voices when discussing politics. Even journalists began writing with caution, aware that someone was watching. Noriega had not fully emerged as a dictator yet, but his presence was already shaping the habits of an entire population. Nighttime in Panama took on a different tone during these early years of Noriega's ascent. The city lights glowed softly across the bay, reflecting off calm waters, but behind the peaceful facade, political movements stirred like currents beneath the surface. Officers loyal to Noriega drove through silent streets, checking on outposts. Informants passed messages under doorways. Meetings took place in dimly lit rooms where the air felt thick with unspoken warnings. Panama was entering a period where power shifted not through declarations, but through shadows. Noriega remained composed throughout it all. He rarely showed anger. He rarely showed excitement. He moved through each moment with the poise of a man who believed destiny had finally opened its hand. Even those who disliked him admitted he had an aura of control, a calmness that suggested he was always 3 steps ahead. Anyone who tried to stand in his way discovered quickly that obstacles were removed efficiently, quietly, and permanently. Yet, even as he consolidated control, Noriega understood that maintaining power required more than just eliminating threats. He needed alliances. He needed leverage. He needed ways to secure his position not just within Panama, but in the wider world. And so he began reaching beyond the boundaries of his intelligence office, expanding his influence into realms that would eventually define his dark legacy: international politics, covert operations, and the lucrative, hidden world of drug trafficking. But in this moment, during these first years after Torrijos's death, Noriega had already achieved something remarkable. Without claiming a title, without standing on a balcony or giving speeches to cheering crowds, he had become the silent master of Panama. The puppet strings ran through his hands, even though the public had not yet seen them. He had entered the throne room through the back door and taken a seat no one openly offered him. Panama did not erupt in revolt. There were no protests, no mass uprisings. Instead, the country simply adjusted, slowly, unknowingly, to a new reality. Noriega was not yet the feared dictator he would one day become, but he was no longer the quiet intelligence officer he once had been. He was now the hidden force directing the flow of power, rising with every calculated move. In the calm hush of those early nights, as the humid air settled over the city and the jungle whispered in the distance, Noriega stood on the threshold of a new era, one built not on charisma or inspiration, but on shadows, secrets, and a growing hunger for absolute control. As the months passed and the shock of Torrijos's death slowly faded into memory, Manuel Noriega's presence in Panama grew heavier, even though his face rarely appeared on posters or in newspapers. He did not seek the public stage, he preferred the shadows behind it. Yet everyone could feel the shift. Something in the air had changed. Conversations became shorter. Criticism became quieter. And the spaces where dissent once flourished began to shrink, almost imperceptibly, until people found themselves breathing in a new kind of silence. Noriega understood better than anyone that power did not need to shout to be felt. It could whisper. It could watch. It could simply exist in the background, shaping behavior without lifting a finger. And so, he ruled not with grand declarations, but with a subtle tightening of control. The military answered to him. The intelligence services were his creation. Files on politicians and business leaders expanded week by week. Even before he carried an official title, Noriega had woven a net over the entire country, one made not of laws or institutions, but of fear. He walked through the corridors of military headquarters like a man surrounded by invisible armor. Officers stood straighter when he passed. Lower-ranked soldiers avoided his eyes. Some admired him, others feared him. Most did both. Noriega's calm expression never revealed what he was thinking, and that uncertainty made him more intimidating than any raised voice could have. People realized quickly that he was a man you did not want to disappoint. During this period, Panama appeared peaceful from the outside. Tourists continued to stroll along the waterfront. The canal remained busy with ships. Markets buzzed with merchants. But beneath this calm surface, tension hummed like a faint electrical pulse. People learned to read the atmosphere the way one might read the sky before a storm. They sensed the invisible pressure. They felt the presence of the intelligence network Noriega strengthened daily, agents who listened, officers who monitored, informants who seemed to multiply overnight. The media, once lively and bold, began altering its tone. Articles grew cautious. Radio hosts paused mid-sentence before criticizing the government. Journalists learned the subtle art of self-censorship, not because they were directly threatened, but because stories circulated, stories of reporters who were visited late at night by stern-faced men in uniforms, of others who simply vanished for speaking too loudly. No one needed to be told what lines not to cross. The lines announced themselves through rumor, through silence, through the quiet disappearance of those who forgot them. Noriega's intelligence network expanded with impressive precision. He positioned trusted individuals in every major government institution. He established surveillance over political opponents, sometimes even over allies. He gathered compromising information on business leaders, not to expose them, but to store it like currency, leverage that could be spent when needed. Those who opposed him discovered that he knew their secrets before they did. Those who supported him often did so because they feared he might know more. In private meetings, he never threatened anyone directly. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make people choose their words with care. He listened closely, nodding slowly, occasionally offering a short comment or a thin smile. He didn't pressure. He didn't coax. He simply left people with the unmistakable sense that he understood everything about them. And so, without ever raising his voice, he gained more influence than any elected official in Panama. At night, Panama City carried a strange stillness. The bright glow of the waterfront masked the quiet anxiety that seeped into neighborhoods and apartment balconies. People noticed more military vehicles on the roads. They heard more stories about neighbors questioned by authorities. They began locking their doors earlier, closing their curtains sooner, limiting their conversations to trusted friends and family. A thin veil of caution settled across the country, as if everyone sensed they were being watched, even if they never saw the watchers. Inside military compounds, the atmosphere was different but equally tense. Officers loyal to Noriega felt empowered, confident, even emboldened. Those who doubted him kept their distance, wary of being seen with the wrong colleagues. Promotions depended not only on merit but on loyalty to Noriega's emerging system. He rewarded those who served him well with better assignments, new uniforms, and privileges. Those who did not cooperate were quietly transferred, demoted, or left in career limbo. No one challenged him openly. Not yet. Part of Noriega's strength came from his ability to play multiple roles at once. To the military, he was their calm and competent chief. To the CIA, he was a valuable regional partner who kept Panama stable. To business elites, he was a negotiator who could keep their interests secure. But behind each of these faces was another layer, the man who tracked opponents, who ran secret operations, who managed informants, and who remembered everything people told him. He was building something larger than a political role. He was building a system centered not on institutions but on himself. His influence seeped into banking, law enforcement, transportation, media, and international relations. Every part of Panama's structure bent gently in his direction. He didn't need the title of president, he already held power beyond it. Sometimes, late in the night, he would sit alone in his dim office, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights above him, scanning intelligence reports and making notes in his precise handwriting. The room smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Outside the window, the darkness of Panama City stretched out like a heavy blanket. These solitary hours were when Noriega felt most in control. He was shaping the country with information, with secrets, with strategic silence. He believed this was how a modern leader should rule, not through speeches, but through knowledge. Not through public praise, but through quiet dominance. Meanwhile, ordinary Panamanians sensed something shifting even if they couldn't define it. They noticed when neighbors suddenly grew cautious. They heard when a familiar shopkeeper whispered that someone had been questioned by authorities. They saw military officers entering buildings late at night. The country wasn't violent yet. It wasn't on fire. It was simply adjusting to a new kind of leadership, one felt more than seen, one heard in the soft footsteps of soldiers at dusk, one carried in the subtle tension that settled over conversations. By the time people began to grasp that Noriega was no longer merely an intelligence chief but the de facto ruler of Panama, it was already too late. He had built his foundation silently, steadily, and with an understanding of human fear that few leaders possessed. In the calm of those early years, he did not yet unleash the brutality he would later become known for. Instead, he relied on control, quiet, invisible, and absolute. The shadows he moved in grew thicker. His influence spread wider. And Panama, without ever voting for him, found itself under the authority of a man who had risen not through public support, but through the silent mastery of fear and information. As Panama drifted deeper into Manuel Noriega's quiet grip, a new force began to weave itself into his growing empire, one that operated far beyond military bases and government halls. It arrived through whispered introductions, late-night meetings, unmarked planes landing on secluded airstrips, and briefcases exchanged beneath the soft glow of Panama's humid nights. It was the world of the cartels, and Noriega, already a master of shadows, understood immediately how valuable their presence could be. The transition was not sudden. It did not begin with grand agreements or dramatic confrontations. Like most things in Noriega's life, it unfolded slowly, quietly, almost naturally. His intelligence networks, already vast and efficient, had begun to detect an increasing number of drug routes flowing through Central America. Cocaine labs deep in Colombian jungles were producing more than ever before, and smugglers needed discreet corridors northward toward the United States. Panama, with its canal, its airfields, its coastlines, and its strategic invisibility, offered the perfect pathway. And Noriega, with his silent control of every important institution, offered the perfect gatekeeper. At first, his involvement was administrative, a favor granted, a blind eye turned, a quiet assurance that certain shipments would not be inspected. The cartels appreciated reliability, and Noriega provided it without hesitation. His military forces kept coastal waters watched but not too watched. His intelligence officers monitored drug movements but reported only what he wished to be known. His connections to the CIA gave him the illusion of legitimacy, making the cartels believe they had found a partner who could navigate international pressure with ease. Panama transformed slowly. Ships sailed through the canal carrying legal cargo above deck and cocaine hidden beneath it. Small planes skimmed low across the ocean surface, landing at abandoned runways protected by soldiers who claimed they were conducting routine exercises. Banks in Panama City, once sleepy institutions serving local clients, began to glow with new activity: cash from Colombia, cash from Mexico, cash from markets that stretched all the way to Miami, Los Angeles, and New York. The money flowed smoothly, quietly, without the noise that drew suspicion. Noriega saw everything. He understood the movement of drugs, the routes carved through forests, the boats gliding through dark waters. But more importantly, he understood the money, how it traveled, where it landed, and how effortlessly it could be cleaned through Panama's banking system. He knew that by cooperating with the cartels, he wasn't merely tolerating criminal activity, he was building a second source of power, one that rivaled any foreign support he received. The first meetings with cartel representatives did not take place in crowded offices or public venues. They happened in secluded houses on the outskirts of Panama City, where walls were thick, and windows were always covered. Men arrived in quiet vehicles, accompanied by bodyguards who lingered outside. Inside, the air felt heavy with humidity and quiet tension. Noriega, dressed neatly in his military uniform, greeted his guests with the calm composure of a man meeting diplomats rather than criminals. He spoke softly, as he always did. He did not ask for promises. He did not negotiate loudly. Instead, he laid out conditions in simple terms. Panama would remain open to their operations. Their money would be protected. Their routes would be uninterrupted. And in return, Noriega would receive payments, steady, reliable, often delivered in cash, sometimes in gold, occasionally in favors or information. The cartel envoys listened closely and nodded, understanding that the man before them was not merely cooperating but orchestrating. As months turned into years, Noriega's relationship with the cartels deepened. He learned their rhythms, the seasons when shipments increased, the weeks when air traffic intensified, the quiet days that signaled upcoming operations. His intelligence officers provided updates not just for state security, but for Noriega's private calculations. If a rival cartel tried to shift into Panamanian territory, he knew. If a shipment went missing, he understood who was responsible. The cartels came to respect him not out of fear but out of awareness that he was a stabilizing force, a silent guardian of their operations. And yet, Noriega never allowed himself to be fully absorbed by them. He maintained a delicate distance, keeping himself useful but never dependent. He knew how cartel empires rose and fell, how alliances broke, how violence swept through communities too quickly to stop. He had no intention of being caught in their internal wars. Instead, he played the role of mediator when it suited him, protector when necessary, and observer always. Panama's nights reflected this transformation. Along the quiet coastline, fishing boats drifted at odd hours, their lights dimmed, their cargo far more valuable than the day's catch. In the jungles, hidden dirt runways seemed to appear overnight, carved by hands working under moonlight. In the banks downtown, late-night meetings took place behind glass doors, where suits and uniforms sat across from each other, discussing numbers that never appeared on official ledgers. And through it all, Noriega remained a calm presence, the silent conductor of a growing symphony of illicit movement. People in Panama began to notice small signs. A sudden influx of wealth in certain neighborhoods. Soldiers patrolling areas with no visible threats. Foreign men staying briefly in expensive hotels, then vanishing as quickly as they arrived. The country still looked calm, still felt safe, still functioned smoothly. But beneath its surface, a new undercurrent pulsed: money, influence, and a kind of power that never showed its face in daylight. Noriega thrived in this atmosphere. The cartels respected him. The CIA still relied on him. The military served him. Politicians feared him. And ordinary citizens barely knew his name beyond the title he held. It was the perfect balance for a man who believed true power should never expose itself too fully. Yet even as the partnership strengthened, even as the money grew heavier and the routes busier, Noriega sensed something important. The world beyond Panama's borders was watching. The DEA gathered reports. Journalists whispered about connections too dangerous to publish. And inside the CIA itself, frustration simmered as conflicting intelligence painted Noriega in a suspiciously contradictory light. But for the time being, the overt tension had not yet exploded. Noriega still walked the line effortlessly, balancing cartels on one side and intelligence agencies on the other. He had become the man who could speak to presidents in the morning and cartel emissaries at night, who understood both diplomacy and danger, who moved through the world with a calmness that belied the storm he was quietly feeding. And though he did not know it yet, this delicate dance would one day collapse under its own weight. For now, the shadows had embraced him fully, the cartels had welcomed him deeply, and the country he ruled quietly moved into a future shaped by deals made in low-lit rooms where trust was temporary, and betrayal only a matter of time. The first time Noriega crossed paths with representatives of the Medellín Cartel, it was as if two different worlds, one of military discipline, the other of criminal ambition, met quietly under the cloak of night. Panama had already become a favored corridor for smugglers, but the Medellín Cartel was not just another trafficking group. It was an empire rising in the mountains of Colombia, a force led by a man whose name echoed across continents with equal parts fear and awe: Pablo Escobar. Escobar's cartel did not deal in small quantities or tentative partnerships. They moved cocaine by the ton, controlled territories the size of small countries, and commanded loyalty with a mix of generosity and ruthlessness that few dared challenge. When their influence approached Panama, Noriega knew immediately that this was not just another opportunity for profit, it was the beginning of a relationship that could reshape everything: his power, his country's economy, and his own future. The initial contact was careful. Medellín envoys traveled discreetly, never in groups larger than 3, always in unmarked vehicles. The first meeting took place in a quiet villa on the outskirts of Panama City, hidden behind tropical trees whose leaves whispered softly in the warm wind. The atmosphere inside the villa smelled of polished wood, expensive cigars, and the faint musk of tension that accompanies men who know their lives depend on subtle decisions. Noriega arrived without fanfare. He entered the room with the same quiet confidence he used in military headquarters: calm eyes, slow steps, the kind of steady composure that made people instinctively lower their voices. Across from him sat cartel representatives, men dressed in crisp shirts, their expressions guarded, their presence carrying a weight that came from living under Escobar's shadow. The dialogue was simple at first. Logistics. Routes. Protection. Airstrips. Banking channels. But beneath the surface, an unspoken understanding formed. Both sides needed the other. The cartel needed Panama's geographic advantage and Noriega's military cover. Noriega needed the money, the leverage, and the intelligence the cartel possessed. And so, with careful nods and quiet agreements, the foundation of their alliance was laid. From that point forward, the Medellín Cartel began flowing through Panama like an underground river, invisible to most, but powerful enough to shape the land around it. Hidden airstrips near the Darien rainforest buzzed with activity, planes taking off at dawn, landing under moonlight, carrying cargo packed tightly in crates marked with false agricultural labels. Soldiers loyal to Noriega guarded these areas with precise indifference, ensuring no one without clearance ever approached. Along the coastline, fishing boats suddenly traveled with greater caution, their captains aware that eyes watched not from rival crews but from Noriega's intelligence network. The cartel's shipments were treated with an unspoken respect, a recognition that interfering meant provoking consequences no one wished to face. In Panama City, the cartel's money appeared like a quiet tide. It entered banks in waves, large deposits masked under shell companies, real estate purchases, luxury imports, and deposits sent through accounts that only Noriega and a handful of trusted associates understood. The banking district glowed with late-night lights as financiers pushed papers across desks, pretending not to notice the origins of the funds they processed. Noriega watched this growth with a calm satisfaction. He saw how the cartel's presence amplified his own power. Cartel operatives whispered about him not with disdain or suspicion but with a kind of cautious respect. They understood that while Escobar ruled Colombia with terror and bloodshed, Noriega ruled Panama through quiet structure. They were different, yet compatible, two forces carving out their own territories, each feeding the other's rise. As the partnership deepened, cartel leaders themselves began visiting Panama. Some came disguised as businessmen, others under false names. They arrived with guarded entourages, but when they met Noriega, they found a man who did not flinch, did not boast, and did not fear them. His authority did not come from violence but from information, knowledge about every shipment, every route, every political movement in the region. The cartel valued that more than any weapon. Pablo Escobar never needed to step foot in Panama himself, his lieutenants did the traveling. But communication between Noriega's intelligence office and Medellín headquarters was steady, encrypted, and efficient. Through these channels, Noriega offered protection, and in return, Escobar provided something he rarely gave anyone outside Colombia: trust. Late at night, Noriega would sit in his office, the lamp casting a dim amber circle across his desk, reviewing intelligence reports that mapped the Medellín cartel's movements. He treated these documents with the same attention he gave military strategies. Each shipment meant profit. Each route meant influence. Each successful transaction meant that Noriega's position grew stronger. Yet, he understood something important: Escobar was not a man to underestimate. The cartel moved with the precision of a state, commanded armies larger than some national militaries, and carried enough firepower to wage war against governments. Noriega respected this power but never surrendered to it. Instead, he maneuvered with his usual discipline, ensuring that Panama did not become dependent on the cartel but remained indispensable to them. Meanwhile, ordinary Panamanians noticed the changes indirectly. Expensive cars appeared in the city more frequently. Certain hotels hosted mysterious guests. New businesses opened with suspiciously rapid funding. But for most people, life continued, markets opened each morning, children played in the streets, and the canal's massive ships drifted by, carrying goods across the world. The shadow economy beneath it all remained invisible to the public eye. The Medellín Cartel and Manuel Noriega had become partners in a silent empire, one built on mutual benefit, shared secrecy, and the confidence that neither side needed to expose the other. It was a relationship that functioned with the precision of clockwork, the kind that could have lasted indefinitely if the world beyond Panama's borders had not begun to take notice. For now, though, their alliance remained strong. The cartel trusted him. Noriega trusted the system. And Panama became the quiet middle ground where one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history found safe passage under the calm, watchful eyes of a man who understood better than anyone how to balance on the edge of danger without falling. As the years passed, Panama transformed into something far larger than a small Central American nation with a famous canal. Beneath its tropical breezes and slow-moving tides, beneath its busy markets and sunlit beaches, another Panama began to pulse, one built on silent transactions, coded messages, and rivers of money flowing unseen through the veins of the country's financial system. Manuel Noriega stood at the center of this transformation, watching it grow with the quiet confidence of a man who understood the mechanics of power better than anyone around him. Money laundering was nothing new to Panama. For decades, wealthy individuals from across the world used the nation's banking system to hide fortunes from tax collectors and regulators. But under Noriega's rule, this shadow economy expanded beyond anything the country had ever experienced. The Medellín Cartel, flush with profits that grew faster than they could count, needed financial systems capable of absorbing millions of dollars each week. They needed banks willing to look the other way. They needed a country where money entered like a whisper and exited like a breeze. Panama offered all of this, and Noriega made sure it stayed that way. The financial district of Panama City was a world of polished glass towers, marble-floored lobbies, and air-conditioned offices where men in dark suits spoke softly over stacks of documents. From the outside, it appeared orderly, professional, even respectable. But behind every friendly handshake was a quiet understanding. Behind every sealed envelope was a code. Behind every transaction was a movement of money that could never be traced directly to its source. Noriega did not need to enter banks himself. He had people for that, trusted intermediaries, lawyers, military officers, and foreign consultants who understood the delicate steps involved in hiding illegal fortunes. They carried documents in slim leather folders, they attended private meetings in corner offices, and they ensured that money flowed smoothly through shell companies, offshore accounts, and false export invoices. To the untrained eye, these transfers looked like ordinary business transactions. To Noriega, they looked like the threads of a growing web, one that tied cartel money to political influence, and political influence back to his own power. Ships passing through the canal at night carried more than legitimate cargo. Some carried cash sealed in crates disguised as spare parts or agricultural supplies. Others carried cocaine, but for Noriega's financial machine, it was the money that mattered most. Once those dollars entered Panama, they were washed clean through a labyrinth of accounts. $1 million might enter through a dummy corporation. Another $1 million might disappear into a real estate project that would never be built. Hundreds of thousands more might be routed through casinos, hotels, or private accounts linked to men who would never ask dangerous questions. Bank managers understood their role. Some were motivated by greed, others by fear, and a few by the belief that helping the regime ensured national stability. Noriega rewarded those who helped him, often quietly, sometimes generously. Luxurious homes appeared along the coast. Expensive cars arrived at military compounds. And through it all, the money kept pouring in, more than any small nation should realistically see. The cartels paid handsomely for protection and invisibility. They saw Panama not just as a stopover point but as a financial sanctuary. While Colombia erupted in violence and Mexico saw rising internal conflicts, Panama remained strangely calm. This calmness was part of Noriega's strategy. A peaceful appearance kept foreign governments comfortable. Tourists kept visiting. Investors kept arriving. And no one wanted to disrupt a country that seemed stable in a region constantly shaken by political storms. But stability was a mask, and Noriega knew it. Late at night, when the city lights glittered across the bay and the humid air settled in a thick, unmoving blanket, he would review financial reports in his dimly lit office. Numbers flowed across the pages, millions entering, millions leaving, each figure representing trust, leverage, and influence. This money gave him something no local rival could challenge. It made him independent of political donations, independent of foreign aid, independent even of the CIA funding he had relied on for so many years. For the first time in his life, Noriega possessed a form of power that did not depend on anyone else. The money also allowed him to reward loyalty in ways that inspired fierce devotion. Soldiers received unexpected bonuses. Officers found promotions waiting for them. Politicians discovered that supporting Noriega opened doors to new business opportunities. These gestures were never announced publicly, but their effects rippled silently across the nation. Those who benefited from the prosperity understood where their fortune came from. Those who didn't benefit understood that standing against Noriega meant being left outside the circle of privilege. Panama's transformation was not just financial. The culture itself shifted. Wealth poured into businesses that operated as fronts, and even legitimate companies became entangled with criminal funds. Restaurants expanded overnight. Construction projects sprang up in empty lots. Luxury stores selling European goods opened their doors in neighborhoods where such items had never been seen. And yet the average citizen remained unaware of the true source behind this sudden surge of prosperity. Tourists strolling along the waterfront saw only beauty, yachts bobbing gently in the marinas, music drifting from elegant bars, and the glittering reflection of skyscrapers on the water. They did not see the suitcases of cash arriving quietly at airports. They did not see the secure rooms where bank officials processed deposits under the watch of men who carried no official badges. They did not see the coded telex messages, the hidden ledgers, the nervous glances exchanged when someone asked the wrong question. Noriega remained at the center of this quiet empire, his eyes always watching, his presence always felt even if rarely seen. He understood that the most dangerous form of power was the kind no one could openly challenge. Money laundering gave him that. It wrapped Panama in a financial fog that obscured the truth from both the public and the international community. It strengthened his position in ways brute force never could. It allowed him to stand with confidence in a world where appearances mattered just as much as actions. Yet even as he reveled in these victories, a faint warning lingered at the edges of his awareness. The more money flowed, the more attention would eventually follow. The DEA gathered intelligence. Journalists whispered. Foreign governments grew suspicious. Noriega knew the risk. But the money was too strong, too irresistible, and too deeply embedded in Panama's new identity to walk away from. For now, the system functioned perfectly. The cartels trusted him. The banks depended on him. The military secured him. And the world, for the moment, looked the other way. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the city slept beneath the weight of its own humid stillness, Noriega often stood by his office window, watching the empty streets below. He understood that the calm outside did not reflect the storm building worldwide. But he also believed he could manage it. He always had. He always would. At least, that's what he thought. For years, Manuel Noriega walked a tightrope suspended between two worlds, one governed by the secret commitments he made to the CIA, and the other powered by the dark, silent currents of the drug trade. At first, he balanced these worlds with the ease of a man born for manipulation. He spoke to American intelligence officers with loyalty in his voice, offering reports on communist movements, guerrilla operations, and political shifts across Central America. And at the same time, he met with cartel envoys who brought cash wrapped in brown paper bundles and promises sealed in nods. To each side, he offered just enough truth to remain valuable, while hiding enough to remain in control. But as time passed, this delicate duality became more dangerous. The Americans were beginning to notice something was off. Reports filtered through the intelligence community hinting that Noriega's influence had grown too quietly, too quickly, and too deeply. Some whispered that he had become more powerful than Panama's president. Others suspected that his unexpected wealth, his sudden new properties, and the luxury flowing through his circle could not be explained through military service alone. Still, the CIA tolerated him, at first. In their eyes, he was a stabilizing force in a region they wanted to contain. He reported on Sandinista movements in Nicaragua, he helped track leftist rebels, and he provided information on arms trafficking. During the Cold War, that made him indispensable. Washington was not yet ready to cut ties with a man who delivered results. Meanwhile, Noriega used the trust of the CIA as a shield. When journalists questioned his rise, when foreign diplomats raised concerns, he reminded them that he worked with the United States. That he was an ally. That he served the interests of stability and order. To many, it sounded convincing. How could a man so closely tied to Washington be corrupt? How could he be involved with cartels when the CIA itself funded him? In the quiet hours of the night, Noriega often reviewed the coded messages he exchanged with American handlers. He studied every sentence, every implication, weighing what he could reveal and what he must conceal. He understood that intelligence was a game of layered truths, not pure honesty. If the CIA trusted him too fully, he would lose leverage. If they distrusted him completely, he would lose protection. So he balanced perfectly on the middle ground, never giving too much, never withholding too much, maintaining the illusion of alignment. This double game required precision. And Noriega excelled at precision. But outside his office, in dim bars and smoke-filled rooms across Central America, murmurs spread. Agents from other U.S. departments, especially the DEA, began hearing stories about Panama's airstrips, its uninspected cargo, its suspicious banking activity. They noticed that certain cartel shipments mysteriously disappeared from radar only to reappear days later across the border. And each time, the invisible route seemed to pass through Panama. The tension grew quietly. The DEA wanted answers. The CIA offered vague reassurances. Noriega played both sides with practiced calmness, but even he knew that the storm was forming. He could feel the pressure building in the tone of American visitors, in the increasingly direct questions asked during intelligence briefings, and in the way diplomats scrutinized his decisions more closely. Still, he held on. And while the Americans debated amongst themselves, the cartels continued treating Noriega as an invaluable asset. Medellín operatives spoke highly of him, praising his efficiency and his ability to shield their operations without demanding the chaos of violence. Noriega did not interfere in their business, he simply managed the risks around it. He became known as a man who could be trusted to maintain order, an anchor in a world built on danger and volatility. The longer he maintained this balance, the more confident he grew. He began to believe he could continue indefinitely, that he could forever remain the man standing in two worlds without falling into either. But beneath the surface of confidence, there was a growing undercurrent of paranoia. He knew that the CIA was not a forgiving master. One wrong step, one exposed connection, one leaked document could turn allies into enemies overnight. So he strengthened his intelligence network further, monitoring not only his political rivals but also any American official stationed in Panama. He watched their movements, tracked their contacts, and gathered his own files on them, insurance, in case the wind shifted. His paranoia was not unfounded. Inside the U.S. government, tension between agencies sharpened. Some believed Noriega was still a valuable partner. Others argued he had become a liability. Internal memos questioned the morality of supporting a man rumored to collaborate with drug lords. Congressional committees scrutinized foreign operations involving Panama. New evidence emerged, small details, whispers, inconsistencies, that painted a picture too troubling to ignore. Washington was starting to see the truth. Yet Noriega kept pretending everything was normal. He invited American officers to dinners, hosted diplomatic receptions, attended ceremonies with smiles that revealed nothing. He continued providing intelligence reports, some accurate, some deliberately skewed. He shared just enough to keep suspicion from fully hardening into action. At the same time, cartel representatives visited him more frequently. Their operations expanded. Their money grew heavier. Their trust in him deepened. The more they depended on Panama, the more Noriega depended on them to maintain financial strength and political independence. Quietly, his allegiance tilted, not toward the CIA, not toward the cartels, but toward himself. He walked between these two powers not as a servant of either, but as a man who believed he could outmaneuver both. But the world was changing. The Cold War was beginning to cool. The U.S. no longer viewed every Latin American strongman as a necessary ally. Public pressure against the drug trade intensified. And the Medellín Cartel grew too powerful, too violent, too visible. Eventually, the United States would no longer tolerate a partner who played both sides. In the dim glow of his office, Noriega sensed that the balance he had maintained so skillfully was beginning to wobble. But instead of stepping back, he stepped deeper into the shadow, convinced he could still manage the forces closing in around him. He did not realize that every move he made from this point forward brought him one step closer to a collision that would shatter everything he built. The morning Omar Torrijos's plane fell from the sky, Panama woke with a heaviness that felt unnatural, like the air itself had thickened overnight. News spread slowly at first, through radio static, through hushed voices on balconies, through neighbors leaning across fences with disbelief written on their faces. Torrijos was more than a leader. He was a symbol of hope, of dignity, of national pride. And yet now, people whispered that his aircraft had vanished into the dense folds of the jungle, swallowed whole by the same land he had dedicated his life to lifting up. For Manuel Noriega, the news arrived quietly, carried by an officer whose footsteps echoed nervously down the hall before knocking gently at his door. Noriega listened expressionlessly as the report was delivered. A plane crash. No survivors. The official explanation was still being shaped, still uncertain. The officer waited for a reaction, for shock, for sadness, for anger, but Noriega simply nodded once, dismissing him with a slow, deliberate gesture. The door closed. Silence returned. Behind that silence, however, his mind moved quickly. Torrijos had been his mentor and ally, but also the final barrier between him and undisputed control. For years, Noriega operated in the shadows while Torrijos held the public spotlight. Now that light had extinguished, leaving only darkness, and in darkness, Noriega always thrived. Still, even Noriega could not ignore the strange unease surrounding the crash. Torrijos was an experienced pilot who flew often. The weather had been stable. Reports mentioned no mechanical issues prior to takeoff. The crash site, deep in the central jungle, offered few answers and far too many questions. The soldiers who arrived first described a scene that felt wrong, almost staged, debris scattered in patterns that did not match typical impact trajectories, personal belongings burned in ways that seemed inconsistent with the rest of the wreckage, and an absence of wildlife that felt eerie for a jungle so alive with sound. Rumors ignited like sparks in dry grass. Some whispered of sabotage. Some blamed foreign intelligence agencies. Others believed political rivals had orchestrated the event. A few even suggested the plane had been brought down intentionally to halt Torrijos's plans for deeper national reform. Panamanians gathered in living rooms with their televisions flickering in the dim evening light, trying to make sense of a tragedy that seemed too convenient for too many powerful people. Radios replayed official statements filled with vague explanations and promises of investigation. Yet each broadcast only deepened the doubt. People could feel in their bones that this was no ordinary accident. Throughout this rising storm of speculation, Noriega maintained a serene composure. He attended the memorial services, stood beside grieving family members, and saluted in uniform as the coffin draped in Panama's flag moved past him. Cameras captured him with solemn eyes and a respectful stance. But behind closed doors, away from prying lenses and curious citizens, Noriega acted swiftly. He met individually with key military figures, speaking to them in his soft, controlled voice. His suggestions sounded like reassurances, but they carried the weight of directives. He positioned himself as the natural successor, not publicly, not through speeches or declarations, but through subtle shifts in tone and authority. Officers who had once looked to Torrijos for leadership now found themselves turning instinctively toward Noriega. Meanwhile, the government scrambled to assemble its narrative. Committees were formed. Reports were written. Yet the conclusions always felt incomplete, vague enough to spark suspicion but polished enough to quiet public unrest. The crash was labeled an accident, tragic, unavoidable, mysterious but not malicious. Many accepted this because they wanted peace. But many did not. As these debates simmered, Noriega reviewed intelligence documents late into the night. Cables from foreign embassies. Internal memos from his own surveillance units. Reports on political movements within the country. He studied them all under the faint glow of his desk lamp, the soft hum of a ceiling fan the only sound in the room. His expression shifted rarely, but when it did, it was a tightening of the jaw or a narrowing of the eyes, tiny signs that he understood more than he let on. Whether he believed the crash was an accident or something more sinister, he kept that belief buried deep within himself. What mattered to him was not the cause but the aftermath. Torrijos had held the loyalty of the masses and the moral backbone of the government. Without him, Panama needed a stabilizing force. Noriega positioned himself as that force with effortless precision. The weeks after the crash were filled with quiet shifts in the country's rhythm. The streets of Panama City moved more slowly. Vendors in the market spoke softly, conversations drifting toward speculation and unease. The newspapers printed stories about national unity, but their tone carried an undercurrent of anxiety. The jungle where the plane fell became a symbol, of loss, of mystery, of a turning point no one could reverse. In rural villages, elders murmured that the land itself had taken back one of its sons. In the upper levels of government, officials whispered that Torrijos's political trajectory threatened too many powerful interests. And in foreign embassies, diplomats exchanged glances filled with meanings they never dared write into official cables. Through all of this, Noriega remained as still and unreadable as a statue carved from stone. He visited military outposts, moving with quiet confidence. He reassured officers that continuity was essential. He offered support to Torrijos's allies while subtly positioning himself above them. His influence expanded like smoke, soft, invisible, and impossible to contain once it seeped into every corner of the room. He also understood the importance of public perception. Though he did not seek to replace Torrijos publicly, he made sure every politician, every military commander, and every foreign representative knew he held the levers of real power. With Torrijos gone, Noriega was the man they needed to consult. He was the one who controlled intelligence. He was the one who managed the military. He was the one who could keep Panama stable, or plunge it into uncertainty. And so, as the nation mourned, Noriega's ascent continued quietly, smoothly, uninterrupted. The jungle had taken one leader, and in the space left behind, another figure emerged, not charismatic, not beloved, but undeniably in control. Panama did not know it yet, but the death of Omar Torrijos marked the beginning of a darker chapter. A chapter in which the shadows grew thicker, the truth grew more elusive, and Manuel Noriega began to shape the future with a precision that suggested he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. In the months and years following Torrijos's death, a new reality settled over Panama, one that felt familiar yet undeniably altered, like a room where all the furniture had been subtly rearranged overnight. People still went to work, buses still clattered down the narrow streets, and children still played in dusty courtyards. But something in the air had shifted. The country had lost the man who spoke to its heart, and in his place rose a figure who spoke only to its fears. Manuel Noriega, once the quiet watcher in the shadows, now stepped into the light, not as a celebrated leader, but as the invisible force guiding everything from behind a curtain only he could lift. His ascent was not dramatic. It did not arrive with applause or declarations. It unfolded with the calm inevitability of a tide rising inch by inch until suddenly the shore was gone. He assumed control of the Panama Defense Forces, tightened his influence over the intelligence services, and surrounded himself with officers who owed their positions to him. He did not need the title of president, he possessed something far more potent, the obedience of the armed forces and the fear of those who dared to oppose him. Panama's political system, fragile even in good times, bent easily under his touch. Politicians who once debated passionately in public now measured their words carefully, calibrating every statement as if Noriega's ears were present in every room. Some believed aligning with him would secure their careers. Others simply feared what would happen if they resisted. Over time, the government became less a collection of competing voices and more an echo chamber, reflecting the quiet authority of the man who rarely spoke publicly but whose presence overshadowed every decision. Beneath this political shift, a deeper transformation touched Noriega himself. The calm, controlled intelligence officer who once served Torrijos began to morph into something colder, more calculating, and more paranoid. Power did not merely settle on his shoulders, it seeped into him, shaping his worldview, hardening his instincts, and sharpening his suspicions. He became a man who trusted few, confided in almost none, and studied everyone. Each gesture, each silence, each whisper became data in the ever-growing archive inside his mind. Yet the most curious change was not his political rise or his increasing paranoia, it was his growing interest in spiritual advisors, astrologers, and practitioners of mystical rituals. Beyond his military strength, beyond his alliances with cartels and intelligence agencies, Noriega sought an invisible layer of protection. He invited astrologers into his home late at night, listening intently as they mapped out his fate in the stars. Advisors burned herbs, performed rituals, and whispered incantations meant to ward off enemies. Even the most skeptical officers noticed the strange items on his desk, amulets, carved talismans, symbols drawn in ink as dark as the night itself. These practices were not public knowledge. Noriega refused to let the world see this part of him. To the outside eye, he remained a rational, disciplined man. But behind closed doors, his paranoia fed his curiosity for hidden forces. His belief in spiritual protection grew deeper with every rumor of betrayal, every whisper of dissent, every shadow that lingered too long on a wall. Rituals gave him a sense of control in a world he increasingly feared was slipping beyond calculation. Panama, meanwhile, adjusted to his rule the way one adjusts to a storm that never breaks, quietly, cautiously, always aware of the tension in the air. Citizens noticed soldiers patrolling neighborhoods more frequently. They saw new checkpoints appear on highways. They heard stories, never fully confirmed, never fully denied, about interrogations that took place in the dead of night. People learned to lower their voices, to pause before naming the government, to avoid asking too many questions about those who suddenly disappeared. Noriega's control extended into the media as well. Newspapers printed cautious articles filled with praise or neutral announcements. Radio stations toned down criticism. Television hosts avoided controversial guests. The government framed these shifts as necessary for national security, but everyone understood the truth. A leader who controlled information controlled perception. And a leader who controlled perception controlled everything. Despite all of this, Noriega maintained a strange public image. To foreign delegates, he appeared polite, even charming in his restrained way. He discussed politics with measured intelligence, spoke about regional stability, and assured diplomats that Panama remained a reliable partner. Some left meetings feeling oddly reassured, unaware that the same calm man who offered them coffee had signed off on surveillance orders just hours earlier. Within the military, his reputation became even more complex. Younger officers admired his discipline, his intelligence, and his ability to predict political shifts before they occurred. Older officers respected his ruthlessness but feared his temper, which rarely erupted openly but manifested through reassignment, demotion, or sudden isolation. His soldiers learned quickly that loyalty was rewarded generously, while disobedience invited consequences swift and silent. Noriega's paranoia grew with his power. He installed additional locks on his office doors, requested background checks on officers he had known for years, and expanded the intelligence service until it resembled a vast web capable of catching even the smallest whispers. He demanded reports detailing who met whom, who traveled where, who purchased unusual items, and who expressed frustration in private conversations. Trust became a luxury he could no longer afford. But it was not only political rivals he feared. He feared the cartels growing too powerful. He feared foreign governments scrutinizing him too closely. He feared the ghosts of decisions made years earlier returning to haunt him. Each threat, real or imagined, tightened his grip on the country, turning Panama into a nation where silence felt safer than truth. Despite the growing tension, Panama's nights remained deceptively peaceful. From a distance, the city lights shimmered along the bay like scattered jewels. Couples strolled through quiet parks, the warm breeze carrying the scent of the ocean. Street vendors sold late-night snacks, their small flames flickering beneath pots of sizzling food. But beneath this tranquility, an invisible unease hovered over the population, like a low hum felt more than heard. In his private residence, Noriega often stood near a window overlooking the city, the lights flickering across his reflective eyes. He watched as cars moved slowly along the roads, as boats drifted lazily in the marina, as shadows shifted along the buildings. The world outside appeared calm. Predictable. Contained. But he knew it wasn't. He knew that whispers were growing louder, even if spoken quietly. He knew that his alliances were becoming fragile. He knew that eyes, American, Colombian, political, criminal, were watching him more closely than ever. But Noriega believed he could manage it all. He believed he could outmaneuver each threat, silence every critic, maintain every alliance, and absorb every challenge. He believed he could remain the man behind the curtain while still acting as the one who pulled every string. He did not yet understand that the very web he built would one day tighten around him. As Noriega's grip tightened, Panama began to feel like a country divided into two worlds. One was the world seen in daylight, bustling markets, children in school uniforms, traffic weaving through sunlit streets. The other emerged only in whispers, the shadowy realm of midnight knocks, secret rooms, and voices lowered in fear. People learned to live between these two realities, carrying on with daily life while sensing the invisible boundaries closing in around them. It didn't happen suddenly. The transformation unfolded slowly, almost quietly, like a fog creeping across the landscape. One night, a journalist known for criticizing the government simply stopped appearing on his radio show. His disappearance wasn't reported. His colleagues spoke about him with trembling voices, glancing over their shoulders as if words alone could summon danger. Another night, a university student was taken by unidentified men after organizing a protest. His friends searched for weeks, walking from police stations to military bases, only to be told he had never been detained. They eventually stopped asking questions. And still, no official explanation was given. Rumors swirled around the existence of hidden rooms inside military compounds, windowless chambers where harsh interrogations took place, where dissidents were broken down slowly, silently. Some said the rooms were soundproofed, built deep underground. Others claimed they were above ground but disguised behind locked doors marked with innocent signs. No one outside the inner circle ever confirmed the truth. But the fear was real. The fear felt like a shadow touching every neighborhood, every home, every mind. If someone vanished, neighbors whispered theories but never conclusions. They spoke in short, incomplete sentences, as if finishing a thought might invite danger. They learned to speak indirectly, using metaphors and hints rather than names. Even families who lost loved ones stopped asking for answers, knowing the silence that followed their questions could swallow them too. The government's message was never written, never spoken aloud, yet everyone understood it: do not challenge. Noriega did not revel in brutality the way other dictators did. There were no public executions, no mass rallies designed to intimidate. His terror functioned like a quiet, invisible current. It did not scream. It seeped. It whispered. It taught people to fear uncertainty, to fear the possibility that someone was always listening. And in some ways, that kind of fear was far more effective. It lived inside people, traveling with them, settling in their bones. Inside military barracks, officers carried out orders without hesitation. Many didn't know the full scope of the operations they participated in. Some believed they were protecting national security. Others suspected the truth but chose not to question it. A few, haunted by guilt, transferred to quieter posts or left the military altogether, only to find that leaving didn't erase the memories, or the fear that someone might one day ask what they knew. The intelligence service expanded rapidly, forming a network that touched every corner of society. Informants blended into daily life: barbers, taxi drivers, shopkeepers, even schoolteachers. People who once spoke freely now weighed every word. A harmless joke overheard in the wrong place could be misinterpreted as dissent. A conversation with a foreigner could raise suspicion. A complaint about rising prices could be reported as subversion. The paranoia spread until people began to police themselves, their silence becoming Noriega's most reliable enforcer. The government's propaganda machine worked in tandem with its repression. Old posters of Torrijos were carefully replaced with images promoting national stability and defense of sovereignty. News anchors delivered carefully scripted reports that praised economic growth and downplayed unrest. When the United States criticized Panama's human rights record, the government dismissed the claims as foreign interference. At rallies, Noriega's supporters waved flags and shouted slogans encouraging unity, even though many of them did so out of fear rather than genuine belief. Yet even as the repression deepened, Noriega remained calm in his public demeanor. He rarely raised his voice, rarely showed anger. Those who met him often described him as measured, deliberate, composed. That was what made him so unsettling. He didn't need rage to command obedience. He projected the same stillness that the ocean sometimes has before a storm, a quiet that hinted at something dangerous beneath the surface. Behind closed doors, he read intelligence files late into the night. Reports on politicians. Reports on students. Reports on religious leaders. Reports on foreign journalists. These documents fed his sense of control and his sense of vulnerability simultaneously. With every page he turned, he saw both threats and opportunities. He believed enemies surrounded him. And that belief shaped every decision he made. Sometimes, during these late-night sessions, he paused to reflect on the arc of his life. He remembered the boy from the slums, the cadet who studied in silence, the intelligence officer who learned to navigate power through information. He saw how far he had come, how deeply he had embedded himself into the country's fabric. But he also sensed something he never admitted aloud: the more he controlled, the more he feared losing control. The more he silenced dissent, the louder it echoed in his mind. The world outside Panama watched with growing concern. Foreign journalists reported stories of disappearances. Human rights organizations published startling testimonies. Politicians in Washington whispered that Noriega had become too unpredictable, too dangerous. But for the moment, these external warnings did not reach the Panamanian people directly. Their days remained filled with the familiar rhythms of work and family life, while the darker truths stayed hidden under layers of silence. In the quiet of the night, Panama felt suspended. Not at war, not at peace, caught in a strange, oppressive stillness. Streetlights cast long shadows on empty roads. In some neighborhoods, the sound of a passing military jeep could freeze an entire block into silence. People looked out their windows carefully, slowly, making sure no one saw them watching. And Noriega, from his office high above the city, looked down at the world he controlled. The lights spread out like constellations below him. The dark ocean glittered faintly in the moonlight. From this vantage point, everything looked orderly, calm, obedient. But he knew better. He knew the calm outside was a fragile reflection of the tension inside. A tension he had created, nurtured, and relied upon. He also knew that power gained through fear carries its own curse. Fear does not disappear. It shifts. It grows. It waits. And one day, it returns. Noriega didn't yet realize that the same shadows he controlled so carefully were beginning to turn against him. The silence he had built so effectively was starting to crack. And the world was preparing to watch as those cracks widened. The story of Hugo Spatafora's final days lingers in Panama like the echo of a scream trapped inside a sealed room, faint, distant, yet unforgettable. His murder was not just another political act. It was a rupture. A moment where the quiet fear that hung over the country suddenly took shape and revealed itself. Spatafora was not a man easily silenced. He had been a doctor, a revolutionary sympathizer, a critic of corruption, and above all, someone who refused to bow his head in the face of danger. That defiance placed him on a collision course with the shadowed figure who ruled Panama from behind locked doors. Hugo had spent months speaking openly about Noriega's ties to drug trafficking and brutality. He traveled between borders, gathering evidence, documenting abuses, and warning anyone who would listen that Panama's leader was guiding the nation into darkness. His bravery frightened some and inspired others, but for Noriega, it represented something more dangerous, a voice he could not predict, a man he could not intimidate, a witness he could not control. Spatafora's words traveled far, reaching foreign journalists and human rights organizations. Each interview chipped away at the silence Noriega had built with such precision. In early September 1985, Hugo decided to return to Panama despite knowing the risk. He told friends he needed to deliver documents that exposed Noriega's direct involvement in cartel operations. They warned him. They begged him to stay away. But Hugo was the kind of man whose convictions outweighed his caution. He believed the truth would protect him. He believed that shining a light on corruption would force the world to act. What he did not fully grasp was how far the shadows had already spread. The last hours of his life unfolded along a quiet road near the Costa Rican border, a stretch of highway surrounded by thick vegetation, the kind that muffles sound and hides movement. Hugo traveled alone, carrying a small bag filled with documents and notes. The evening air felt unusually still, the sky dimming into a soft blue-gray as night approached. He did not know that men were waiting for him, men trained to follow orders without question, men whose faces he might have recognized had fate offered him a few more moments of clarity. The ambush was swift. The vehicle stopped. Doors opened. Boots hit gravel. The kind of silence that precedes violence filled the air. Passers-by later recalled seeing a commotion at the roadside, but no one dared stop. In a country where speaking out had already become dangerous, witnessing the wrong thing could carry a price no one wanted to pay. Spatafora was dragged away, taken to a remote location near a small outpost controlled by forces loyal to Noriega. What happened next became the subject of investigations, testimonies, and nightmares. He was beaten, interrogated, tortured. The blows were merciless, carried out with the cold detachment of men performing a task rather than committing a crime. Hugo fought, not with strength, his body couldn't endure the brutality, but with the stubborn will of a man who believed his truth mattered. But truth has little power inside a room where the doors lock from the outside. When dawn arrived, his body was dumped in a sack and left near the border, as if the perpetrators wanted Costa Rica to discover the horror rather than Panama. It was a message, cold and calculated. A message that traveled far beyond the jungle where his life ended. News of his death spread like poison through the country. People heard whispers in markets, radios delivered guarded reports, newspapers printed cautious paragraphs heavy with implication. The brutality was undeniable. His decapitated body was unmistakable. And for the first time, the fear that had lingered like a low cloud above Panama suddenly hardened into collective disbelief and quiet rage. The world reacted quickly. Human rights groups demanded answers. Foreign journalists flew into the region, their notepads filled with names and questions that hovered dangerously close to Noriega's throne. Governments spoke out. Ambassadors sent cables with alarming language. And inside Panama, the citizens who had been swallowing their fear for years finally felt the weight of silence cracking. Noriega responded with calm denial. His voice sounded steady, rehearsed, even sympathetic as he expressed sorrow over Hugo's death and promised investigations that everyone knew would lead nowhere. Behind closed doors, however, his reaction was far less composed. Spadafora had been a threat, but his death became something far more damaging, a spotlight that shone directly into the darkest corners of his regime. At night, Noriega reviewed reports detailing the international response. He saw phrases like extrajudicial killing, political assassination, human rights crisis. He understood instantly that Hugo's murder had torn a hole in the veil he worked so hard to maintain. For years he had operated through shadows, keeping his public image untouched by the brutality carried out in his name. But now, the shadows had betrayed him. Or perhaps he had relied on them too much. Either way, his secrets were bleeding into the world. Inside the defense forces, officers exchanged uneasy glances. Some felt guilty. Others felt afraid. Most understood that a line had been crossed, one that could not be erased or explained away. Even those loyal to Noriega sensed that Spadafora's death would eventually force a reckoning. For the people of Panama, the murder became a turning point. Conversations in living rooms shifted from quiet resignation to quiet questioning. The courage to speak had not yet returned, but the fear that once restricted every whisper had begun to fracture. Spadafora had been one man, but his death symbolized something larger, the moment the country fully realized the depth of Noriega's capacity for brutality. Still, no protests erupted. No marches occurred. The silence remained, but its tone had changed. It was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence that precedes a rising storm. Hugo's ghost lingered in Panama. You could feel it in the way people exchanged glances when his name was mentioned. You could feel it in the slight tremble of those who dared to tell his story behind closed doors. You could feel it in the way foreign governments shifted their stance toward Noriega, from cautious tolerance to growing hostility. Noriega, sitting alone in his dimly lit office with the humid night pressing against the windows, understood that Hugo Spadafora had become more dangerous in death than he ever was in life. And though he never admitted it, not even to himself, he sensed that this murder would someday return to him, not as a whisper, but as a blade. In the wake of Hugo Spadafora's murder, the distance between Panama and the United States began to stretch, like a rope pulled tighter and tighter until even the slightest movement caused it to strain. For years, Washington had tolerated Noriega's contradictions, his secrecy, his brutality, his growing wealth, his flirtations with the cartels, because he was useful. He was their eyes in Central America, the man who quietly monitored guerrilla movements, reported communist sympathies, and provided intelligence that aligned with U.S. interests. But after Spadafora, something in the American government began to shift. Doubt seeped into conversations. Suspicion edged its way into classified reports. And in time, the doubt turned into distrust. It started subtly. Diplomatic cables took on a new tone. Meetings that once carried friendly warmth became colder, more formal, filled with careful phrasing instead of open conversation. American officials who once shook Noriega's hand with confidence now did so with restraint. In Washington, committees began revisiting old intelligence files, rereading reports that once seemed harmless but now carried unsettling implications. Yet the United States moved cautiously. Noriega was still deeply entrenched in their regional strategies. Removing him too quickly risked destabilizing Panama, jeopardizing canal operations, and sending shockwaves across Central America. Still, pressure was building, and Noriega could feel it. His instincts had always been sharp, and he sensed that the comfortable balance he once maintained, between cooperation and manipulation, was slipping out of his control. The first major warning came in the form of sanctions. Small at first, restrictions on aid, limitations on military equipment, freezes on certain accounts. But symbolic. These measures acted like silent alarms, reminders that the political winds in Washington were turning. Noriega pretended not to care, but behind closed doors, he studied the sanctions with a growing awareness that something larger was approaching. He called urgent meetings with his intelligence advisors. They pored over intercepted communications, diplomatic summaries, and political analyses. The United States was not acting impulsively. They were building a case, brick by brick, documenting Noriega's links to drug trafficking, his corruption, his abuses of power. And though Noriega had spent years hiding behind the shield of his CIA connections, he sensed that shield weakening. Day by day, the tension between Panama and the United States deepened. Foreign journalists began arriving in greater numbers, their questions probing more boldly. Each televised segment, each newspaper article, each whispered rumor weakened Noriega's facade. The international community started paying attention to Panama not as a canal nation, but as a country led by a man whose secrets were becoming too visible to ignore. When the U.S. Senate issued a formal condemnation of Noriega's regime, it hit him harder than any sanction. It was a sign that his former allies had begun to align publicly against him. He had seen this pattern before, in other countries, with other leaders. First came the quiet warnings. Then the sanctions. Then the investigations. And finally, the isolation. Still, Noriega refused to bend. He believed he could outmaneuver the rising tide, just as he had outmaneuvered every threat in his past. He traveled to military bases, rallying support. He reassured his officers that Panama remained sovereign, that the United States was overstepping its bounds, that foreign interference would not dictate the nation's fate. His calm voice carried confidence, but inside him, a small seed of fear began to form, an unfamiliar feeling that he tried to smother with strategy. He turned to his intelligence apparatus with renewed urgency. Surveillance increased. Opposition figures were monitored more intensely. Informants were dispatched to track any citizen who maintained contact with American officials. Noriega believed that knowledge would give him the upper hand, as it always had. But the information that returned felt different this time, darker, heavier, filled with warnings he could not easily counter. Panama's economy began to feel the strain. Sanctions disrupted trade. Banks grew nervous. Businesses watched the political climate with wary eyes. The once steady flow of money through Panama's financial system began to slow, and the cartels, sensing instability, became cautious. Some whispered that Noriega had lost control. Others said the Americans were closing in. Inside Noriega's residence, the nights grew longer. He spent hours pacing the floor, his steps muffled by thick carpets, the humid air clinging to his skin. He spoke with spiritual advisors, searching for guidance in rituals and symbols. He sought protection from forces seen and unseen, drawing comfort from the idea that destiny was still on his side. But no ritual could silence the unease growing within him. Meanwhile, the United States took bolder steps. They cut economic aid entirely. They suspended military cooperation. They issued travel restrictions on Panamanian officials. Suddenly, Noriega's regime found itself standing alone on an international stage that once welcomed it. The most devastating blow came when American intelligence agencies began leaking information to the press, files that detailed Noriega's involvement with the cartels, transcripts of conversations, photographs of meetings. Slowly, the world began to see what Panama had whispered about for years. And yet Noriega remained defiant. He stood before the nation, appearing on television in his crisp uniform, voice steady, eyes unblinking. He spoke of sovereignty, of foreign aggression, of Panama's right to self-determination. He painted himself as a defender of the nation against outside meddling. To some, his words sounded convincing. To others, they sounded desperate. Night after night, he reviewed every new sanction, every new accusation, every new diplomatic action. Each one was a thread tightening around him. He began to realize that the United States no longer viewed him as an ally or even a useful tool. They viewed him as a threat. And threats, especially in the realm of geopolitics, were rarely left standing. Panama felt the pressure too. The mood in the streets grew tense. Military checkpoints became more frequent. Opposition groups, emboldened by the international spotlight, began speaking more openly. And all the while, Noriega watched from his office window, the city lights shimmering like distant stars, beautiful, distant, and fragile. He had survived every challenge so far through strategy, intelligence, and quiet ruthlessness. But this was something different. He was no longer fighting political rivals or local dissidents. He was now facing a superpower with growing determination to remove him. The storm was gathering, all the signs were there. And Noriega, standing at the center of it, believed he still had moves left to play. He did not yet understand that the game was already changing, and soon, the United States would stop watching and start acting. The night the invasion began did not announce itself with thunder or warning. It came quietly at first, like the subtle shift of a breeze before a storm breaks open the sky. Panama City was wrapped in its usual humid warmth, streetlights casting long reflections along the bay, and the soft hum of distant traffic fading into the darkness. People slept, unaware that the world around them was about to split open. And in those final peaceful moments before dawn, only a handful of men knew what was coming, one of them being Manuel Noriega. He had sensed it for weeks. The way American diplomats avoided eye contact. The way military transport planes appeared suddenly in nearby regions. The way U.S. intelligence grew silent, too silent, as if holding its breath. He knew something was approaching, something vast and unavoidable. Yet even with all his instincts alert and his networks activated, he could not prepare for the scale of what was about to unfold. Operation Just Cause began just before midnight on December 20, 1989. The first signs came as tremors, distant vibrations carried through the warm night air. Then the sky filled with shapes that moved like shadows with wings. Hundreds of aircraft, helicopters, C-130 transports, gunships, descended from the dark horizon. Their engines rumbled like an approaching storm, the kind that shakes windows and warns the soul that something irreversible has begun. The city slowly awoke to the deep, rhythmic thudding of rotor blades, to the roar of heavy machinery cutting through the quiet. In the opening moments, U.S. forces targeted key military installations across the country with precision. Bases that usually glowed softly with their midnight lights suddenly erupted with bursts of gunfire and explosions. The ground shook. Windows rattled. Dogs barked hysterically in distant suburbs. People climbed out of bed, confused and terrified, staring at skies streaked with flame and smoke. Some soldiers in Panama's defense forces scrambled for weapons, others froze, unsure of what orders to follow. Many had heard rumors of an invasion, but seeing it unfold was something else entirely. Tanks rolled through streets they once patrolled during peaceful afternoons. Helicopters hovered above rooftops as if scanning every shadow, every window, every opening where resistance might hide. Noriega watched the chaos unfold from a secure location, surrounded by officers whose faces reflected fear they struggled to conceal. Reports poured in, some incomplete, some frantic, some quietly resigned. One base had fallen within minutes. Another was surrounded. A third was still holding out, though everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The Americans moved with overwhelming force, over 27,000 troops, coordinated with precision, striking simultaneously across the country. He listened to the radio chatter, the coded transmissions, the panicked voices. Each message confirmed what he already knew: Panama's forces were outmatched. This wasn't a coup, or a rebellion, or a border skirmish. This was the full weight of the United States military, a force so vast that resistance felt like trying to hold back a tide with bare hands. Outside, the city descended into a surreal mix of fear and confusion. Families huddled on floors as gunfire cracked in the distance. Streets emptied. Lights flickered. The smell of smoke drifted through neighborhoods that had never imagined they would become battlegrounds. At the canal, U.S. forces secured the area with swift efficiency, ensuring that the vital waterway remained under their watchful control. Noriega knew he could not match their power. He had prepared bunkers, safe houses, loyal officers, but none of it could withstand the scale of the invasion. The Americans weren't just trying to weaken him. They were trying to remove him entirely. The moment of realization hit him quietly. He stood near a window, watching distant flashes illuminate the night. The calmness that had served him throughout his entire life, through alliances, betrayals, wars, and secrets, remained in his posture. But beneath that stillness, a truth settled into him with the weight of inevitability: he was no longer controlling events. Events were controlling him. His next steps became a series of desperate calculations. He shifted between safe houses, moving with urgency yet maintaining the composed expression of a man who had lived his life navigating danger. Soldiers loyal to him escorted him through alleys and back roads, headlights off, engines humming softly. They passed checkpoints manned by foreign troops. They heard explosions echoing from neighborhoods they once knew intimately. At one point, Noriega attempted to rally his remaining forces, but communications were compromised. His messages were intercepted. His commands were delayed or distorted. Some officers tried to resist, others surrendered quickly, understanding the futility of fighting a massive superpower. The nation that once bent quietly under his rule was now being reshaped by forces far beyond its borders. Through it all, Noriega's expression remained eerily calm. He did not scream. He did not panic. He watched his empire collapse with the same quiet observation that had defined his childhood, his rise, his intelligence work. But inside him, a storm was raging, a storm of betrayal, anger, confusion, and a dawning awareness that his life had entered its darkest chapter. As the night gave way to dawn, Panama City lay under foreign occupation. Smoke curled upward from buildings struck during the initial assault. Soldiers patrolled streets normally filled with morning vendors and schoolchildren. The sound of boots against pavement replaced the usual morning chatter. Noriega, now on the run, moved from safe house to safe house, each one growing less secure as U.S. forces tightened their grasp. Helicopters circled overhead with loudspeakers demanding his surrender. Leaflets fluttered through the air like desperate messages from the sky. Wanted for drug trafficking. Wanted for corruption. Wanted for murder. Wanted by the United States government. Every hour narrowed his options further. Each hiding place felt temporary, fragile, exposed. His world, once controlled by secrets and surveillance, was now collapsing under a flood of soldiers and global attention. And through it all, one question echoed in the back of his mind: where could a man like him hide when the entire world was looking? He would soon find the answer, but not tonight. Tonight, Manuel Noriega was a fugitive in the country he once ruled without challenge. A man running through the shadows of a city that once feared him, now illuminated by the relentless spotlight of a superpower determined to bring him down. When Manuel Noriega slipped into the Vatican embassy, the world outside was cracking open with noise, but the moment he crossed that threshold, everything fell into an almost sacred stillness. The air inside the building felt cool, heavy with incense and old wooden walls that had witnessed decades of quiet diplomacy. For the first time since the invasion began, he found himself in a place untouched by the chaos outside, a fragile sanctuary built on centuries of tradition, far removed from the modern violence he had spent his career mastering. The embassy staff did not greet him warmly, but they accepted him. He arrived exhausted, disheveled, his uniform wrinkled, his eyes carrying the weight of sleepless nights and a lifetime of secrets. Even in his desperation, he held himself with the controlled stiffness of a man who had always tried to appear calm, even in disaster. The priests who received him recognized a man unraveling, though he tried to hide it behind a mask of military discipline. Outside, Panama City trembled. U.S. troops tightened their grip on every district. Roadblocks materialized like steel borders around neighborhoods. Helicopters circled the skies day and night, their blades chopping the humid air into restless vibrations. Streets that once echoed with vendors and schoolchildren were now lined with soldiers scanning every doorway and alleyway. And through loudspeakers suspended on helicopters, Noriega's name echoed constantly, amplified through the city like a haunting chant. Surrender now, Manuel Noriega. You are surrounded. You cannot escape. The messages reached every home, every street corner, every shuttered window. And they reached the embassy too, vibrating faintly against the thick walls, reminding everyone inside that the world was closing in. Inside the embassy, Noriega moved quietly from room to room, trying to appear composed but unable to escape the weight pressing down on him. He ate little. He slept even less. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes, military bases falling, loyal soldiers captured, streets filled with foreign troops. He had built a life in shadows, but now there was nowhere to hide. Every choice he had made, every alliance he had leveraged, every secret he had weaponized, all of it had led him here, to a building he did not control, surrounded on all sides by a force greater than any he had ever faced. He found solace in the chapel late at night. He would sit in the back row, staring up at the flickering candles and the painted saints glowing faintly in the dim light. The silence felt almost unnatural to him. For years, his life had been shaped by coded messages, urgent reports, whispered threats, and late-night strategy meetings. Now, there was only the creak of wooden pews and the soft echo of his own breathing. The priest spoke to him occasionally, offering gentle words that floated through the air like cautious prayers. They saw a man stripped of power, a man facing the reckoning he had outrun for too long. Noriega responded sparingly, his answers short, his tone controlled. But his eyes, those dark, watchful eyes that had once scanned intelligence reports with surgical precision, now revealed a man lost in his own mind, a man circling memories he could no longer contain. Outside the embassy, the Americans grew impatient. They could not enter without violating diplomatic law, but they could make life unbearable. And so they did. Day and night, they blasted loud, relentless music, rock, metal, high-volume anthems, forcing the sound to vibrate through the embassy walls like an unending wave. Some believed it was psychological warfare, others said it was designed to break the embassy's resolve, but most understood the truth, it was meant for Noriega alone. The music echoed through the hallways, shaking picture frames, disrupting conversations, shattering the fragile peace that the priests tried desperately to maintain. Noriega felt the noise drilling into his skull, into his thoughts, into his nerves. He tried to meditate. He tried to focus. But the rhythms pounded through the building with no mercy. Sleep became impossible. His hands trembled. His thoughts frayed. At times, he paced the embassy halls like a ghost, slow, restless steps, his shoulders hunched, his mind racing. At other times, he sat motionless in a chair, staring blankly at the floor as if the tiles held the answers he craved. Hunger faded. Time blurred. Even the priests, who tried to comfort him, began to sense the unraveling inside him. Panama City watched this surreal stalemate unfold. Some citizens gathered near the barricades, looking toward the embassy with mixed emotions, anger, curiosity, relief, disbelief. Others watched from windows as journalists circled the area, their cameras capturing the strangest chapter of Noriega's life, the once feared dictator reduced to a cornered man hidden inside a foreign sanctuary, tormented by music in the night. Inside, Noriega began feeling the full weight of isolation. He tried to read, but the words swam. He tried to pray, but his mind wandered to memories he had long avoided. Faces of those betrayed. Voices of those silenced. Moments of power that now felt hollow. He thought of Torrijos. Of Spadafora. Of alliances that once steadied him but now felt like anchors pulling him into a dark sea. He had always believed he could outmaneuver fate, that intelligence and caution could solve any problem. But in these long, sleepless nights, he began to understand something painful: his life had been built on illusions of control. And now, those illusions were dissolving. His fate was no longer in his hands. After days of pressure that felt like years, the Vatican representatives grew desperate for a resolution. Diplomats negotiated. U.S. officials pressed harder. Panama trembled under the uncertainty. And Noriega, exhausted, mentally frayed, spiritually hollow, realized that the walls that once protected him had become his cage. The moment of surrender came not with anger, but with quiet resignation. Noriega stepped out of his small room, his posture stiff but his expression softened by defeat. He walked through the embassy hallway slowly, each step echoing like the closing of a long, dark chapter. The priests watched him, some with sympathy, some with sadness, as he approached the exit that would lead him into custody. Outside, the world waited: soldiers, journalists, cameras, lights. The air was thick with humidity and expectation. And as Noriega walked into the open, surrounded by military police who moved with rehearsed precision, he felt the finality of the moment settle around him like a shroud. The man who had once navigated shadows with mastery now stood exposed under the harsh glare of global scrutiny. There were no more secrets to protect him, no more alliances to save him, no more shadows to hide in. He was no longer the invisible ruler of Panama. He was a prisoner. When Manuel Noriega entered U.S. custody, the world he once controlled vanished in an instant. The man who commanded armies and intelligence networks now lived inside a small cell with nothing but a steel door and silence for company. His trial unfolded under bright courtroom lights, where witnesses described drug deals, secret meetings, and the violence of his regime. Noriega listened without expression, but inside, he felt the unraveling of everything he had built. Prison life stripped him further. The days blurred together: meals, lights out, roll calls. With no power left to wield, he was forced to confront memories he once buried beneath authority: the disappearances, the betrayals, the alliances that turned into chains. The silence around him grew heavier with each passing year. He was later sent to France, then finally returned to Panama for additional sentences. By then, he was older, frailer, and a shadow of the man once feared by a nation. His final years were spent in hospital beds and cold cells, drifting between clarity and confusion. When he died in 2017, the world reacted quietly. No fanfare, no mourning, only the quiet closure of a long, dark chapter. Power had left him years before. In the end, he passed away not as a ruler, but as a forgotten prisoner. After Manuel Noriega's death, Panama moved on quietly, as if a long-standing shadow had finally faded from the edges of its memory. His name surfaced only occasionally, in classroom discussions, in old documentaries, in stories told by older generations who had lived through the tension of his rule. To the youth, he was little more than a figure in history books, a reminder of a time they never experienced. The city he once controlled has transformed. New towers rise along the coastline, cafes fill with music, and people speak openly without fear of hidden ears. The silence that once defined Panama's nights has been replaced with the noise of a growing, confident nation. Historians still debate him. Some say he was a creation of the Cold War, shaped by foreign forces and abandoned when the world changed. Others argue he was the architect of his own downfall, a man consumed by ambition and shadowed alliances. In truth, he was both, a leader built by secrets, undone by them. Today, Noriega remains a cautionary tale more than a memory. His legacy reminds Panama how fragile freedom can be, and how easily power can twist into darkness. But his absence also proves something greater: shadows eventually fade, and nations heal.